Welcome to HardScript.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said it while standing in the doorway, already halfway out of the room. Intimacy is a distraction. Not cruel, not angry, just efficient, like she was closing an app she no longer needed running in the background. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my uniform pants, boots unlaced, the smell of antiseptic still stuck to my hands. The shift had ended 30 minutes earlier, but my body hadn't caught up yet. 12 hours on the ambulance. 2 cardiac calls. 1 overdose that didn't make it. I hadn't spoken a word since walking in. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, thumb moving fast, eyes sharp and awake in a way that had nothing to do with me. That was the moment something went quiet. My name is Mark Halstead, 39, ER paramedic for the city of Denver. I work nights, weekends, holidays. I'm used to pressure, to blood on concrete, to making decisions when people are screaming. I don't raise my voice. I don't panic. I stabilize and move. Claire used to say that was what she loved about me. She was already dressed for work the next morning, blazer laid out on the chair, laptop charging on the counter. Insurance law, risk analysis. Everything in her world ran on probabilities and outcomes. Lately, so did our marriage. I watched her pack her bag while I finished a glass of water I didn't remember pouring. She talked about a workshop she'd signed up for. Leadership clarity, strategic alignment. A man named Evan Reed, a business coach, she'd started mentioning the way people mention weather, casually but often. She didn't look at me when she said he helped her see distractions for what they were. I nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. That night, she slept facing away from me. Phone on the nightstand, screen lighting up every few minutes with silent notifications. I didn't ask. I didn't check. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling fan, counting rotations until my breathing slowed. At 4:17 in the morning, my chest tightened. Not panic. Something physical. I sat up slowly, waited it out, the way I'd tell a patient to. It passed. At 6, she was already in the shower. Steam under the door. Music playing softly, something calm and instructional. When she left for work, she kissed my cheek like she always did. Brief, polite, clean. The apartment didn't feel empty after the door closed. It felt managed. That afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was trying to sleep. A message from Claire. She'd be late. Dinner wasn't a priority right now. Growth required focus. I read it once. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand and turned it off. That was the first move. I didn't say anything. I just stopped reaching. The next few days settled into a rhythm that looked normal from the outside. Schedules aligned. Groceries restocked. Bills paid. We moved through the apartment like co-workers sharing a workspace, efficient and polite, never colliding. I picked up extra shifts. Not because I needed the money, but because the ambulance was quieter than home. On calls, there was purpose. A pulse to find. Airway to clear. Something you could put your hands on and make better or not. No ambiguity. Claire started coming home later. Not dramatically late. Just late enough that dinner became optional, then unnecessary. Her calendar stayed open on the kitchen counter, color-coded blocks stacked tight. Evan's name appeared more than once. Coaching session. Group call. Strategy review. She mentioned him while brushing her teeth, voice muffled by foam. She said he challenged her thinking. She said he helped her eliminate noise. She said intimacy, emotional labor, the constant checking in couples did, all of that drained energy better spent elsewhere. I listened from the doorway and adjusted the towel rack that didn't need adjusting. One night, I came home shaking. Not visibly. Internally. A rollover on I-25. A family of 4. The youngest had a pulse when we loaded her. Lost it halfway to the hospital. I'd done everything right. Still lost. Claire was on the couch, laptop open, earbuds in. I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for her to notice. She didn't. Her screen reflected charts and clean lines. Growth projections. I showered. The water ran hot enough to sting. When I came out, she'd closed the laptop and was typing on her phone. She looked up and said she was proud of me for holding things together during a tough week. She said resilience mattered. I sat down across from her and rested my forearms on the table. She paused, then sighed, like someone anticipating a delay. She said she couldn't hold space for heavy emotions tonight. She said she had an early call with Evan in the morning. She said this phase required discipline. I nodded. Same as before. That night, I slept on the edge of the bed. Not to make a point, just because there was no room where I usually was. The following morning, I made coffee for one. When she came into the kitchen, she noticed the empty second mug and hesitated. Not long enough to speak, just long enough to register the change. Later that day, my doctor called. Follow-up from a routine exam I'd postponed too long. Elevated markers. Stress-related, maybe more. He suggested rest. Monitoring. Adjustments. I thanked him and hung up. That evening, Claire texted that she'd be home late again. Something about a breakthrough conversation. She said growth wasn't linear. I didn't respond. I put my phone in a drawer, closed it, and went to bed early. The apartment stayed quiet. So did I. The doctor's office smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. Familiar. Comforting in a way Claire no longer was. I sat on the paper-covered table while he talked about numbers that were slightly off. Nothing dramatic. Not yet. Elevated inflammation. Blood pressure creeping higher than it should. He asked about sleep. I told him it was fine. He asked about stress. I said I handled it. He looked at me the way doctors look at patients who say that. Then he suggested cutting back on night shifts. Suggested support. Suggested I listen to what my body was doing before it forced the issue. I nodded. Same motion. Same economy. That evening, Claire was home earlier than usual. She was energized, almost bright. She talked about clarity, about frameworks, about how Evan had helped her see that emotional dependency was a learned behavior, not a requirement. She said people confused closeness with security. She said she was learning to stand on her own. I listened while reheating leftovers. The microwave hummed between us. She noticed the cuff on my arm from earlier. Asked what it was about. I told her it was nothing. Monitoring. She relaxed immediately, like a system alert resolved without escalation. She said she didn't have the bandwidth to take on someone else's health anxiety. She said it kindly, like a boundary, not a rejection. That night, she worked late at the table while I lay in bed awake. The light under the door stayed on past midnight. I counted breaths again. Slow. Controlled. The tightness came back, sharper this time. I sat up and waited. It passed. In the morning, I rearranged my schedule. Dropped 2 shifts. Picked up daylight hours instead. I didn't tell her. There was no reason. My calendar changed quietly. Over the next week, I stopped initiating anything. No touches that lingered. No checking in. No small updates from work. When she spoke, I responded. Calm. Direct. Minimal. The way I'd talk to a supervisor during a handoff. She noticed the efficiency before she noticed the absence. She asked if something was wrong. I said things were fine. She accepted that faster than she should have. Evan's name came up more. She quoted him once, something about removing friction from systems. She laughed, said it was funny how applicable it was to relationships. I smiled. Brief. Controlled. One afternoon, I came home to find a book on the table. Emotional Independence. A note inside, written neatly, suggesting it might help me recalibrate. No accusation. Just a recommendation. I put it on the shelf without opening it. That night, I slept through until morning for the first time in weeks. When I woke up, Claire was already gone. A text waited on my phone. She'd left early for a strategy session. Something about alignment. I read it, then deleted the notification. The apartment was quiet again. Not empty, just organized. The shift that broke something wasn't dramatic. No sirens stuck in traffic. No bodies on sidewalks. Just a long, grinding 12 hours of chest pains, falls, confusion. People afraid, but not dying. The kind of day that wears you down without giving you a reason to remember it. By the time I clocked out, my hands were steady, but my legs felt hollow. I drove home slower than usual, windows cracked, cold air keeping me alert. The apartment lights were on when I pulled in. Claire was already home. She was at the table again. Laptop open. Notebook beside it. Her phone propped upright. Evan's face frozen mid-expression on the screen. A pause call. She looked up, smiled quickly, and said she'd unpause in a second. Something about a final insight she didn't want to lose. I nodded and walked past her to the sink. My reflection looked older than it had a month ago. The lines around my eyes deeper. I filled a glass, drank, refilled it, drank again. When I turned back, she was still talking. Animated. Focused. She didn't notice I'd sat down across from her until I did it slowly, deliberately. She muted the call. Her smile faded into something measured. She said she needed to finish this. She said it was important. She said I understood, right? I said nothing. The pressure in my chest came back, heavier this time. Not sharp, dense. I recognized it. Not from training. From experience. I leaned back in the chair and waited, breathing slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way I'd coach someone else through it. Claire watched me now. Concern flickered, then calculation. She asked if I was okay. I told her I'd had a long day. She said she didn't have the capacity for emotional processing tonight. She said we could schedule a check-in later in the week. She said reacting from fatigue wasn't productive. The call on her phone resumed automatically. Evan's voice filled the room, calm and confident, talking about boundaries, about removing dependencies. I stood up. The movement caught her attention fully. She muted the phone again and asked where I was going. I said I needed air. Outside, the night was quiet, cold enough to clear my head. I sat on the steps and waited for the pressure to ease. It took longer than before. When I came back in, the call was over. Claire was typing notes, already moving on. She didn't ask if I'd been okay. She asked if I'd interrupted something important. I shook my head once. That night, I slept on the couch. Not to make a statement, because my body didn't trust the bed anymore. At 3 a.m, I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, vision tight around the edges. I sat up and waited, counted, stabilized. In the dark, I realized something. I could manage this, just not with her in the room. By the end of that week, the apartment had settled into a new equilibrium. Not argued into place, not negotiated, just adjusted, the way muscles compensate after an injury. I moved my things with precision. A charger relocated to the living room. Work boots lined up by the door instead of the bedroom. I started prepping my meals on Sundays again, labeled containers stacked neatly in the fridge. Chicken, rice, vegetables. Fuel. Predictable. Efficient. Claire noticed the changes the way she noticed everything else lately. As data points. She commented on my new schedule first. Day shifts. Fewer nights. She asked if it was permanent. I said it worked better right now. She accepted that answer without pushing. She started talking more. Not about us. About ideas. About growth models. About Evan's framework for optimizing personal output. She said he challenged her to audit her emotional investments the same way she audited risk portfolios. I listened while washing dishes. Rinsed. Dried. Put them away. One evening, she asked if I felt disconnected. I told her I felt rested. That seemed to confuse her. The physical symptoms didn't disappear, but they stabilized. The tightness came less often. When it did, I handled it. Saturday. Breathed. Waited. I didn't mention it. There was nothing to gain by adding variables. Claire began to fill the silence herself. She explained why intimacy wasn't necessary for partnership. Why shared goals mattered more than shared feelings. Why frictionless systems performed better. She said she wasn't obligated to inspire anyone. That partners should be self-sustaining. I nodded. She started scheduling things without me. Dinners with colleagues. Seminars. Weekend retreats. She stopped asking if I wanted to come and instead told me she'd be gone. I said okay. Every time. The absence created space she didn't know how to measure. One night, she came home energized and stopped short when she saw me at the table, calm, eating alone. No plate set for her. No question waiting. She hesitated, then asked if I'd eaten. I said yes. She stood there a moment longer than usual, like she was waiting for something else. When it didn't come, she moved past me to the bedroom. Later, she reached for me in bed. Not urgently, just checking. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in either. She withdrew her hand slowly, as if testing whether the silence would react. It didn't. The next morning, she left early without kissing me goodbye. At work, a supervisor asked if I was okay. Said I seemed different. Quieter. I told him I'd simplified things. He nodded like that made sense. That evening, Claire sat across from me and said something had shifted between us. She said it felt like I'd stepped back. I looked at her and waited for the rest. She said she didn't understand how it happened so fast. I took a breath, steady, controlled. I told her nothing had happened fast at all. And for the first time, she didn't have a metric for that. The shift didn't come all at once. It announced itself in small hesitations. Claire started watching me more closely. Not with suspicion, with curiosity, like I'd become an unfamiliar variable in a system she thought she understood. She asked neutral questions. How was work? Was I tired? Did I want anything from the store? I answered cleanly. No extra detail. No invitation. She began to linger in rooms I was in, sitting across from me instead of beside me, waiting. The silence didn't feel the way it used to. It stayed intact. One afternoon, my doctor called again. The follow-up numbers hadn't improved as much as he'd hoped. He suggested imaging, suggested taking the warning signs seriously. I scheduled the appointment and wrote it into my calendar. I didn't mention it to Claire. That evening, she came home earlier than usual. No laptop, no earbuds. She cooked dinner. Not efficiently, carefully. She asked about my day and waited for the answer instead of multitasking through it. I told her it was steady. After we ate, she said she felt like we were drifting. She said she didn't recognize the dynamic anymore. She said it was unsettling not knowing where she stood with me. I rinsed my plate and set it in the rack before responding. I said things were quieter now. She said quiet didn't mean healthy. I looked at her and held the pause longer than necessary. She said she missed how I used to reach for her, how I used to check in, how I used to make space. I nodded once. Later that night, she lay awake beside me. I could feel it in the way her breathing didn't settle. At some point, she turned toward me and rested her hand on my chest, light enough to retreat quickly if needed. My heart rate stayed even. She pulled her hand back slowly. The next morning, she asked if I still wanted this marriage. Not dramatically, carefully, like a lawyer phrasing a question to avoid traps. I said I was here. That answer didn't satisfy her. She started pushing gently, suggesting counseling, suggesting a shared retreat, suggesting we revisit our goals. She framed everything as optimization, alignment, course correction. I didn't refuse. I didn't agree either. A few days later, she mentioned Evan again, said he'd warned her that when one partner disengaged emotionally, it often meant unresolved resentment. She asked if that was what this was. I met her eyes and waited until she finished. Then I said I wasn't resentful. That seemed to unbalance her more than anger would have. That night, she cried quietly in the bathroom. I heard it through the door. The sound didn't pull me in. Not because I didn't care, because I'd already stepped out of the role she needed me to play. The space between us wasn't hostile. It was finalizing. The appointment was on a Tuesday morning. Imaging. Quiet room. Machines humming like distant traffic. I lay still while they took pictures of things I couldn't see but knew were there. Pressure. Stress. Accumulation. Afterward, I sat in my truck longer than necessary before driving to work. The city moved like it always did. Sirens somewhere far off. People crossing streets without looking. Nothing had changed. Something had. Claire texted around noon. A simple question. Was I free for dinner tonight? No qualifiers. No frameworks. I answered yes. She chose the restaurant. Neutral place. Clean lines. No memories attached. She arrived early and stood when I walked in, like this was a meeting she wanted to get right. She talked first. Said she'd been thinking. Said she felt the distance. Said she didn't like not knowing where she stood. She said she was open to recalibrating priorities. That maybe she'd overcorrected. That maybe intimacy had a place after all. I listened and folded my napkin carefully. She said Evan had warned her that control could become a defense, that too much optimization could hollow things out. She said she didn't want that to happen to us. I nodded once. When she finished, she waited, long enough that the silence started to feel intentional. I told her about the appointment, about the follow-up, about the recommendation to slow down. I said it evenly. No emphasis. No appeal. She reached for my hand this time and didn't pull back immediately. She said she wished she'd known sooner. Said she would have shown up differently. Said she didn't realize how close things had been. I looked at our hands on the table. Hers warm, steady, familiar. I said she had known, just not in a way that fit her language. Her grip tightened slightly. She said she could change that. She said she was ready to show up now. I took my hand back gently. Not abrupt. Just enough. I said I believed her. That surprised her. She said then what was the problem? I told her there wasn't one. The word landed wrong. She frowned. Waited for explanation. I said the quiet had already done its work. She didn't understand that. Not yet. We finished dinner without conflict. Without raised voices. Without collapse. Outside, she stood close to me on the sidewalk, like proximity might reset something. Before we parted, she asked if we were okay. I told her we were honest. That answer stayed with her longer than anything else I said. That night, she lay awake again. I slept straight through. In the morning, she watched me pack a bag for work and asked where I was going after. I told her I'd be staying with a colleague for a few nights. Her face shifted then. Not panic. Recognition. She said she hadn't realized this was already happening. I zipped the bag and picked it up. I told her it had been happening quietly for a while. The spare room at my colleague's place was small and quiet. Clean sheets. Neutral walls. No history. I slept better there than I had in weeks. No tightness. No counting breaths. Just rest. Claire texted the first night. Not long messages. Short ones. Checking in. Asking how I was. I replied with the same economy I'd used at home. I was fine. Work was steady. I'd be back in a few days. On the third day, she asked if we could talk. I said yes. We met at the apartment. Neutral ground again, though it didn't feel neutral to her anymore. She'd cleaned. Everything was in its place. Candles on the table, unlit. She looked prepared. Not defensive. Focused. She said she'd been thinking about what I said. About quiet doing work. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd treated the relationship like a system. How she'd assumed it could idle without consequences. I listened from the doorway. Didn't take off my jacket. She said she could see now how she'd replaced presence with control. How Evan's language had made distance feel like progress. She said she was ready to step back from that. From him. From the framework. She said she wanted to reconnect. I walked past her and set my keys on the counter. The sound was small but final. I told her I believed she meant it. That wasn't enough for her anymore. She asked if I still loved her. I didn't answer right away. I said love required contact. Not proximity. Not contracts. Contact. And that contact had been called a distraction long before I stepped back. She sat down then. Slow. Controlled. Like she was trying not to collapse into something emotional. She said she hadn't meant it that way. She said she'd been overwhelmed. Burned out. Trying to keep everything together. I nodded. I told her I understood pressure. I worked inside it every day. I knew what it did to people when they tried to outrun it instead of letting someone stand with them. She looked up at that. Eyes wet. Not dramatic. Real. She said she wanted to be that someone now. I took a breath and felt my chest. Steady. I told her the quiet had already taken that position. It had kept me alive when I didn't have space to be anything else. She asked if there was still a way back. I told her I didn't know yet. That I wasn't angry. That I wasn't punishing her. That I was listening to what my body had already decided. She nodded slowly. When I left, she didn't follow me to the door. That was new. And it told me more than anything she'd said. The distance changed the tempo of everything. Claire stopped texting first. Not immediately. Gradually. The messages spaced out, then thinned. When she did reach out, the tone was careful, as if she was testing how much pressure the connection could take before breaking completely. At work, I moved cleaner than I had in months. Fewer shifts, sharper focus. I followed through on the medical recommendations without announcement. Adjusted my diet. Slept regular hours. My body responded the way systems do when you stop abusing them. Quietly. Efficiently. One afternoon, my supervisor pulled me aside and asked if I wanted to take a training role. Daytime. Predictable. Less chaos. I said yes without hesitation. The decision landed easily. That surprised me. Claire noticed the changes when I came by the apartment to pick up mail. She watched me move through the space like a guest who knew the layout, but no longer belonged to it. My things were still there, but they'd lost gravity. She said she'd stopped seeing Evan. Said she'd realized how much of herself she'd outsourced. She said she was learning to sit with discomfort instead of reframing it away. I listened from the doorway again. She asked if that mattered. I told her it mattered to her. She asked if it mattered to me. I took a moment before answering. I said it would have mattered earlier. That landed harder than anything else I could have said. Her composure cracked then. Not loudly. She didn't cry or raise her voice. She just sat down, suddenly unsure of where to place herself. The confidence she'd worn like armor slipped because it no longer had anything to push against. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd relied on my steadiness until it wasn't available. She said she thought strength meant not needing anyone. I nodded once. I told her strength meant knowing when someone was standing with you and not treating that as background noise. She looked up at me with something close to fear. Not of me. Of the space she'd helped create. She asked if I was leaving for good. I said I was already gone in the ways that mattered. We stood there without touching. Without urgency. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was settled. As I left, she followed me to the door, but didn't ask me to stay. That was the moment she understood the cost. Not because I punished her. Because there was nothing left to negotiate. The Quiet had closed the account, and it hadn't asked permission. The paperwork came later, quietly. No drama, no deadlines forced by anger. Claire suggested mediation. I agreed. We divided things with the same efficiency that had once held us together. Accounts, furniture, responsibilities. There were no arguments because there was nothing left to fight for. I moved into a small apartment closer to the station. Morning light, minimal furniture. A place designed for recovery, not memory. My health stabilized. The follow-up scans showed improvement. Not perfect, manageable. The body responds when it's finally listened to. At work, I trained new hires. Showed them how to slow down under pressure. How to keep their hands steady when everything around them was chaos. I didn't talk about my marriage. There was no lesson there that needed explaining. Claire reached out once more after the papers were signed. Not to negotiate. Not to ask for anything. She said she finally understood what she'd done. How calling intimacy a distraction had trained her to ignore the one place where reality actually lived. She said Evan's language no longer worked now that there was nothing left to optimize. I read the message once. Then I closed it. Not because I was cruel. Because the response had already been written in the silence. Months passed. Life filled itself in. New routines. New weight distribution. The Quiet stayed, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was supportive. Like good structure. Like breath returning to a lung that had been compressed too long. One evening, after a late training shift, I sat on the steps outside my building and watched the city settle. Sirens in the distance. Windows lighting up one by one. People moving through their lives, convinced they had time to notice what mattered later. I thought about how easily warmth gets reclassified as inefficiency. How quickly presence becomes optional when someone sells you control instead. And how irreversible it is once you teach yourself not to reach. Claire didn't lose me because she chose growth. She lost me because she chose distance and called it clarity. I didn't leave loudly. I didn't make demands. I didn't disappear overnight. I stayed. I stabilized. I went quiet. And when she finally understood what she'd lost, there was no one left to explain it to. Some endings don't arrive with slammed doors or raised voices. Some just lower the volume until there's nothing left to hear. That's how this one ended. Not broken, just finished. Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. This is where we talk about what doesn't get forgiven.